Does injecting ribs make them better? And if it does, what's the best way to inject them? We're gonna find out in this video, so let's get smoking. Welcome to the Smoke Lab, guys. I'm Steve Gow, and on this show, I do crazy barbecue experiments you would probably never do at home, so you can learn from my trial and error. Injecting your ribs, is it worth it? A lot of barbecue competition teams swear by injecting their ribs with commercial injections like Kosmos Q and Butcher BBQ. These injections contain things like salt, flavorings, and phosphates to make meat juicier and better tasting. But is it really worth it for your regular weekend rack of ribs? And if it is worth it, what's the best way to inject? To find out, I'm smoking 5 racks of ribs using my long hold method. One rack is the control rack. I'm not injecting that at all. The second rack I'm injecting with just plain water. There's some evidence that just injecting or marinating meat with just plain old water actually increases its water holding capacity, so I'm gonna test it out. I'm injecting the third rack with Kosmos Q Moisture Magic. This is a pure phosphate mixture. Similar to what salt does, phosphates increase the water holding capacity of meat, so I'm trying this out just by itself. The fourth rack I'm injecting with a low concentration of Kosmos Q pork injection, half a tablespoon to 1 cup of water. I'm doing a low concentration because I'm a little bit worried that if I add too much salt, or in this case, pork injection, then it'll actually have the opposite effect that I'm looking for and dry out my ribs, because I'm long holding these ribs for 18 to 20 hours. And during that long hold time, at the end of cooking these ribs, it can actually continue to brine and dry out the ribs if the concentration of salt inside of them is too much. And the fifth rack, I'll be injecting with a normal concentration of Kosmos Q pork injection to see if it actually does dry it out or if it makes it better. Next, I'm rubbing all of the ribs with Oklahoma Joe's Kansas City style rub, just giving a light coat to the back, then flipping them over and a heavier coat on top. While those soak up the rub and injection, I'm lighting up my Oklahoma Joe's Longhorn offset smoker, just piling up some charcoal and wood split and using my Oklahoma Joe's charcoal starter to light them. I'm saying Oklahoma Joe's a lot, I know. I got a lot of Oklahoma Joe's products though. After those have burnt down to coals, I'll be adding some smaller splits to maintain temperatures somewhere between, I don't know, 225 and 250. Now the ribs are going on the smoker at between 225 and 250 degrees Fahrenheit with a bit of foil to protect the edges, just to help against those hot spots at the firebox end and the stack end. I'm now laying down a tablespoon of bacon up bacon grease on some aluminum sheets, followed by some clarified butter, also called ghee, about 5 tablespoons of that. It looks like more than 5 tablespoons here, maybe 6 or 7. Then I'm wrapping all the ribs up tightly, and they're gonna hold at 150 degrees Fahrenheit for the next 18 to 20 hours. And during that time, they're gonna get super tender. It's kind of like sous videing or confitting in this case, because I'm cooking it in fat, low and slow over a long period of time. The next day, I'm taking out a 6th experimental rack and injecting it with full strength Kosmos Q pork injection. I'm rubbing it with the same rub, then smoking it up to 165 internal, wrapping it until it gets tender at around 205 degrees Fahrenheit. This is so I can compare one rack that's been cooked the traditional way, which is probably the way that you're used to cooking ribs. You foil them and then you take them all the way up to like 200 degrees Fahrenheit until they get super tender and almost fall off the bone, but not too tender. And I'm gonna compare this traditional rack of ribs with my long hold method ribs. Now all the racks, including the ones in the holding oven, are getting sauced, and we're going to let them smoke away at around 250 to 275 degrees Fahrenheit for an hour until the sauce tacks up on the surface. Quick note, I usually sear my ribs before I sauce them, but in this case, I just wanted to isolate the effects of the injection, so I didn't really want to add another variable into the mix in the form of searing my ribs. All right, guys, let's take a look at these ribs. Right here, I have the control ribs. Nothing was done to them. Nothing was injected into them. Right next to them, I have the water-injected ribs. Then I have the weak concentration Kosmos Q pork injection. And finally, over here off camera, I have the high concentration pork injection. So let's take the control ribs. These will just serve as a kind of basis for how everything else is gonna compare. I'll give you guys a look. So I squeeze it. I mean, it is pretty juicy, but it's not incredibly juicy. And sorry for my voice, I'm sick right now, so trying to get through the day. All right, let's take a bite of this. Very good, very juicy. Pulls clean off the bone. That's exactly what we like to see. This is a really good rib. I really like it. Yeah, that's really juicy. I'd be surprised if any of these were juicier than that. Okay, let's take a slice of the water-injected ribs. Let's see if they're any juicier than the ribs that had no injection. So I'll squeeze that. It looks a little bit juicier, but it's hard to tell if it's just from that fat seam. Let's give it a taste. It is juicier. So the ribs that were injected with just water are a little bit juicier than the control ribs that weren't injected with anything. That could be because there was more available moisture in the ribs to hydrolyze the collagen, render out that collagen. It could be because we cooked at such a low temperature that we didn't get to those high temperatures that would cause all the moisture of the ribs to be squeezed out. So a lot of that moisture that we injected into the ribs in the form of just plain water actually stayed in the ribs. But whatever the reason, it is juicier. Okay, these are the phosphate injected ribs. I'm just gonna slice a double rib here. I'll give you guys a look. That's looking pretty juicy. Wow. That's super juicy. Really, really, really juicy, really porky. A lot of pork flavors coming through. It's almost like a medium rare pork chop type flavor. It's really good. It actually is juicier than the water injected ribs, and the muscle texture is closer to like a medium rare pork chop almost. So it has modified the muscle texture. The thing is, it tastes a little bit off. It tastes kind of alkaline. It tastes like very low concentration baking soda because those phosphates are pretty basic. And whenever I'm judging barbecue competitions and I bite into a rib, I can immediately tell if it's been injected with phosphates. And it turns the ribs a little bit more metallic-y in flavor. And while it retains moisture, it takes away and detracts from the actual flavor. So for that reason, I don't know if I really like the phosphate injection, but this rib is super juicy. Super juicy ribs though, wow. Really juicy. All right, these are the weak concentration pork injection ribs. So I'm actually really excited to see what these taste like. I think they do have phosphates in them as well, that pork injection, but it should have a lot of extra flavor as well. Okay, squeezing that a little bit. It's a thinner rib, so keep that in mind. It does look pretty juicy though. It's juicy. It's probably about as juicy as the control ribs or maybe the water injected ribs. And I can taste a little bit of extra saltiness in the interior of the ribs, but surprisingly, it didn't really add much to the flavor. Okay, now we're gonna do the full strength pork injected ribs. Uh-oh. We got a rack down, guys. 5-second rule. Just give that a little bit of a wipe. Nobody has to know about this. Let's take a look at this. Whoa! That looks really juicy. Look at that, guys. Holy moly. That's pretty crazy. Very juicy. Let's see what it tastes like. A lot of flavor in that rib. Sorry, I had to pig out on this rib because it tasted so good. It does have a lot of extra flavor all the way to the interior of the meat, so this one's probably my favorite so far. And surprisingly, I thought that it would have tasted a little bit drier and beef jerky-like in texture because of all the extra salt added, but surprisingly, it tastes really good. Okay, now we have the traditionally smoked ribs here. These were taken up all the way to around 205 degrees and they got super tender. So let's give this guy a slice. And there is the rib, looks super juicy. That actually looks really good. Pretty clean bite through. It tastes really juicy. The fat is really well rendered. The collagen's really well rendered. It tastes really good. The only thing I'd say about it is the muscle fibers. They taste a little bit kind of overdone and pot roasty, like if you cooked a pork roast way too long. And the muscle fibers are dry, but the amount of collagen and fat rendering more than makes up for it. And it's super juicy as well. I think that injection actually did a really good job. So I'm gonna compare that to the long hold method ribs now. These ones just taste a little bit more juicy. The muscle fibers taste more porky, like a kind of medium rare pork chop flavor. Okay, so let's answer the first question. Does injecting your ribs make them juicier? I think categorically yes. Based on this experiment, all of the ribs that I injected, with the exception of one of the ribs, which was pretty thin, so I think that was an outlier, they were all better than the non-injected ribs. Even the one that was just injected with water was actually better than the non-injected ribs. Second question, what is the best way to inject your ribs? Is it just to inject water, just to inject phosphates like Kosmos Q Moisture Magic? Is it to do a weak concentration of a pork injection or a regular strength of a pork injection? I think that my favorite ribs were the ones that were injected with a regular strength concentration of the Kosmos Q pork injection. They just had more flavor all throughout the meat and they were juicier, so they were definitely my favorite. I would probably stay away from the pure phosphate injection because it does make your ribs taste a little bit more on the metallic-y side, even though it does help them retain moisture. They kind of taste basic, alkaline, like baking soda, and you can really pick up on that. And whenever I eat a rib that's been injected with a high concentration of phosphates, I can really tell. And if you don't want to spend any money on commercial injections, then actually injecting water based on this experiment actually does something, and it improves the juiciness of the ribs. So thanks so much for watching, guys. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Oklahoma Joe's YouTube channel. If you have any ideas for future smoke lab experiments, let me know in the comment section below. I will see you in the next video, and until then, happy smoking.